Hello, this is BPSC 031, Spring Wildflowers, um, lecture one for our third week of lecturing online or remote classes. This week we are going to see the last part of plant reproductive morphology. On this Monday, April the 13th, we're going to see inflorescences, the aggregation of flowers, and in next Wednesday and possibly part of Friday, we're going to discuss a little bit the fruits of plants, the properties of fruits. So let me start with plant reproductive morphology, and in particular with the meaning and the evolutionary role of inflorescences. It is a well-known fact in the study of the reproductive behavior in multicellular organisms that a large number of species aggregate in some way or other to facilitate the process of reproduction. This is a photo that a colleague and collaborator of mine took, and he won a National Geographic Award for it. It's called David and Goliath. David is the name of the photographer and dive master that was photographing with my friend Dr. Aburto that day. And what you see here, although it looks scary, these fish have no intention at all of attacking David, hence the name Goliath. It looks like threatening, like menacing, but they're making like a whirl, like an eddy in the water of fish turning around in very, very dense aggregations. And fish will do that in order to reproduce. They get together, and it's this sort of ritual dance in which they turn around and turn around and turn around. And in doing so, males and females will get together, will explore each other, will do some sort of courting, and at some point they will depart from the mass of aggregated fish. These are, by the way, yellow-tailed jacks. They will depart, I was saying, from the mass of aggregated fish, and fish don't copulate. The female will eject eggs into the water, and the male will immediately come behind her and cover the eggs with milt, which is basically the sperm of fish. And then they go back to the whirlwind of fish turning around and do the dance all over again. So fish actually congregate at sometimes of the year during some seasons in order to have their own type of courtship, select a mate, and reproduce. Fish are not the only ones. You might have seen, of course, they're a matter of big documentary interest, the large herds of animals in Africa. Perhaps less known are the aggregations of birds in guano islands. Guano islands were really important until 100 years ago, because many countries in Europe used to come when the birds were not there and collect with spades the guano, which is basically bird excrement. And guano islands formed after hundreds or thousands of years in which the birds come to different islands and they nest there. And of course, they also defecate around their nests. And over a large number of years, the defecation of the birds will start increasing like a sediment, and that was used by Europeans in the 18th century to take back to Europe as a fertilizer for their agricultural fields and also as a source of nitrogen to make explosives. The reason why guano islands form is because birds get together every spring. In this case, this is the elegant term, Thalasseus elegans, that is all around the coast of the Americas on the Pacific side of the coast. And they get together in one island south of the Mexico-US border in Mexico, a very small island, all of them, like 1 million birds congregating in the island. And first, the ones that have formed a couple will start making their nests. The ones that have not formed a couple will start doing their courtship and dancing and knowing. The males will try and court with as many females as they can, and the same females will court with as many males as they can until they find a mate that is suitable for them, and then they pair for life, and every year they do their nest. But basically, why do they do this? Why do they aggregate in one large island? Or the question, we can also say it for the case of a fish, why do they get together in such huge numbers in order to reproduce? Well, there are many advantages in aggregating during reproduction. One, the most obvious one perhaps, is the ability to exchange gametes with the best possible mate. If you have them all together there and both the males and the females can court and explore different sexual alliances, different associations, relationships, so to speak, in the case of birds, because birds have long-lasting relationships. Many bird species, seabird species, have way more lasting relationships than human beings do, as a matter of fact. So another important thing is that they get protection from predators. When they're all together, they can defend themselves much better than when they're nesting alone. So a predator like an aggressive seagull or a falcon will trepidate in attacking a rookery of birds, an aggregation of birds as big as this one, because the birds will respond, and they are in large numbers, although they are not as mighty as a falcon or a kestrel can be. They are in very, very big numbers, and they can defend themselves quite well. Another reason in the case of birds for aggregation is, of course, that the birds can take turns in taking care of the nest. So if one member of a colony, or even sometimes if two members of a nest need to go and fish, they always have cousins, quote unquote, cousins, related birds around them that will take care of the chicks. So basically, this idea that when organisms become aggregated, their chances for reproduction are improved is also very important in plants. An aggregation of flowers in plants is known as an inflorescence. And plants have very commonly plants have inflorescences, which is basically, by definition, is an arrangement of a cluster of flowers on a floral axis. And there's a series of nomenclature here. I will pass the nomenclature. You have it in your lecture notes, and we'll try and show it in this image. This is a typical a scheme, a drawing, a diagram of a typical plant inflorescence. You have here a stem growing upwards, and at some point a signal, a hormonal signal, is given in which, instead of producing large photosynthetic leaves, the stems are producing much reduced leaves. The leaves are very, very small, and the leaves will branch. Remember the architecture of a plant metamere. It has a leaf in a node, an internode, and then another leaf in a node, and branching will occur from the axil of the leaf. So you have branching from the axils, and these leaves, because they're reduced, we don't call them true leaves. We call them bracts. Remember the word bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S, is basically a general word we use in botany to indicate any leaf that is transformed, often reduced, and doesn't play the typical leaf role in photosynthesis. So the main stem of the inflorescence is known as the rachis of the inflorescence. The base of the inflorescence is the pedicule, and uh, the stem that substance each of the flowers is the pedicel, as we've seen before. So here we have a photo, a typical photo of an inflorescence. You have a pedicule that supports the whole inflorescence. You have the stem once it starts flowering. The stem, we call it the rachis, it's the central axis of the inflorescence. And the flowers are attached to the stem by a pedicel. Now, there's a lot of variation in inflorescences type. We will start here with the first and most simple type of inflorescence. You have a stem that produces reduced leaves that are known as bracts, from which peduncules branch off and they give a flower. So it's a stem with flowers branching off from the stem. This is probably the most typical type of inflorescence, and it is known as a raceme. This is a raceme. It comes from the Greek rachemos, which, from the Latin rachemos, which is basically the name they used to give to the grape bunch from the grapevine plant. Okay, so the raceme is basically the most simple type of inflorescence, one stem that branches off with flowers, and all the flowers are congregated along the stem. The raceme has two variations, which are quite easy to understand. Sometimes the pedicel of the flowers is very, very short, so much so that the flowers seem to be sitting on the central axis, on the rachis of the raceme. When that happens, the inflorescence is a set of highly dense flowers sitting on an axis, and we will call that a spike. And then on the other extreme, in some plants, the lateral branches do not give a terminal flower and that's it. The lateral branches may branch again, and then they may branch again and give more than one flower on each lateral branch, as the illustration shows here. When this happens, when you have this type of inflorescence, we call it a panicle. So a panicle is a widely open inflorescence, sort of profusely branched raceme that has more than one branching level, has primary branching and secondary branching at least, and that will make a panicle. So basically the spike and the panicle are two variations of the central motif of the raceme, and you can understand how from a simply branched stem that gives flowers, you can elaborate on the subject, giving very, very dense inflorescences as in the spike, or very widely open inflorescences as in the panicle. In some plants, what you will see is that in the raceme, the branches point sort of upwards, and the lower branches are longer than the upper branches, so much so that they make a sort of canopy, an umbrella-shaped canopy. And that type of inflorescence is known as a corym. The adaptive value of coryms is obvious just by looking at this illustration. Insects visiting one flower can jump very easily to another flower because all the flowers are at the same level, and it doesn't demand for the insect to fly from one flower to another. They're all in close proximity. This is like a dome of flowers on which the insect can literally walk. In some plants, especially in, for example, the carrot family, or also in the geraniums, in the corym, or in the ancestral corym, the internode length has become very, very shortened, so as to make all the pedicels of the flowers appear to be branching off from a central point. This is to flowers what, remember we saw it last week, what a rosette is to leaves. A rosette is a group of leaves that seem to branch from a very, very short stem. An umbel is a set of flowers that seem to arise from a central point from an incredibly shortened stem. And again, the merit or the advantage of umbels is the fact that insects can walk from one flower to the other. They make really compact aggregations of flowers. And then imagine an umbel in which the pedicels of the flowers become shortened and shortened until all the flowers are attached to the base of the umbel, to a point of the stem where the leaves was, where the point where the rosette developed. When you have that, what you develop is basically a daisy. Daisies are quote unquote, we call them flowers. They're really inflorescences in which all the minuscule little flowers are sitting at the base of the attachment of the umbel. Imagine an umbel in which all the pedicels became shortened. And so this structure here is called a disc. These are the bracts now that will show in the lower part of the structure. All this structure is called a head, also a capitulum. Capitulum in Latin means basically a head. So these are the main types of inflorescences that you will find in nature. There is another type of inflorescence that, although it's not so common, we need to see it because it's very important for some of the families that we're going to see in our classes. And that is the cyme. A cyme is a type of inflorescence in which a stem produces a flower. So the flower is produced at the top of the stem. Then one of the leaves below the stem produces a branch and a flower. And then another leaf below the stem produces a branch and a flower. And then another leaf below the stem produces a branch and a flower. So this will tend to give you, cymes will give you a dome-like structure, very similar to the corymb or to the umbel. But the main difference between a cyme and the corymb or the umbel is that the older flowers, the most mature flowers, are in the central of the dome. While if you allow me, I'll go back to the umbel, for example, or the corymb. In the corymb, the older flowers are outside. If you look at the inflorescence from above, you will see a dome with older flowers outside and the younger flowers in the center. In the cyme, you see exactly the opposite. The oldest flowers are in the center of the inflorescence. This is really rare in the plant kingdom, but there is one type of inflorescence that is very common in two families, the Hydrophyllaceae and the Boraginaceae, which are very important and common California wildflowers, which is known as the helicoid cyme, also known as the scorpioid cyme, because it looks like a scorpion tail. Well, let me tell you what happens in these two families. The stem will produce a flower, and then here in the illustration, the corolla has already been lost, and you can see the fruit, the capsule forming. And then below the stem, it produces a branch that gives a flower. You can see here that the corolla is wilting, it's an old flower. And then below that flower, it produces a branch that will give a flower. And see here, the flower is at its peak of maturity. The corolla is open and receptive. And then below that branch, it gives another flower. And here you can see the flower as a bud. The petals are not, in the corolla, not yet open. And then below that branch, it gives another flower that is here and a closed bud. It's only the sepals that you see, etc., 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 so on and so forth. And because it always branches in the same direction, it tends to give this the shape of a helix, like the tail of a scorpion. Let us see some photographs and it will be much clearer for you. Here we have, let us start in the center with a raceme. This is from two plants that have raceme. This is wild California cherry, and this is a plant in the cabbage family, Capsella. And you can see the flowers attached to the central rachis by pedicels. Basically, it's flowers attached to the central rachis by pedicels. In the spike, you see the spike can look very, very similar to the raceme, but the flowers are sitting in on the central rachis. They're not attached by pedicels, so the inflorescence is much more compact. In the panicle, on the other side, what you see is second order branching. So you have the central rachis, it branches, and then it branches again, and it might branch again a third time to give the flowers in an open and very complex structure that is known as a panicle. In an umbel, this is from the milkweed, you will see that all the pedicels of the flowers seem to arise from a central point. As I was telling you, a rosette of pedicels arising from a central point. And here you have a head, a capitulum, which is, as I was telling you, heads are exclusive of one family. That is important. We're going to see it later when we start seeing the specific families, which is the sunflower family. And sunflowers, daisies, and all the plants in that family are really inflorescences. Here you see the cut of a flower. We're going to see it in way more detail when we go to the family. And you can see here the ovaries of the flowers and the petals, and these little plumose things, feathery things are the sepals. So they're highly transformed and highly aggregated inflorescences. And then here you have a cyme in which you see the stem that produces an old flower, and then it produces the second oldest flower, and then it produces the third oldest flower, so on and so forth. So it starts ripening from the center. Compare this to the umbel. In the umbel, the youngest flowers are in the center, and the ripe flowers are on the edge. So basically, that is all you need to know about inflorescences. I would challenge you to go out if you can and get any plant that does produce an inflorescence. In the oral lecture that I will give on the Monday, we will show some plants here in the screen, live plants. So I hope to give you a better idea of the type of live inflorescences that you can collect and observe them. It's really interesting. Okay, so now we are going to start, at least, an analysis of a plant fruit. So a fruit, basically, let me stop sharing for a while. A fruit basically is the ovary after pollination. Once the ovary in the flower gets pollinated, normally the corolla wilts and dies, the stamens, the sexual parts, the male sexual parts wilt and die, and the ovary, that case with the fertilized embryos inside, the ovules have been fertilized and they're embryos now, starts growing. And the end product of the growing of the ovary is the fruit of the plant. Fruits have an amazing diversity of forms and, as you know very well, of taste, of flavors, of colors, all sorts of things, because plants compete really strongly. Apart of competing for pollinators, they compete very, very strongly for dispersal. And so there's been selection for the fruits to be attractive to different animals so they can disperse the seed into the environment. So basically a fruit, very often, not always, because there are plants that are dispersed by wind or rain, and in those cases, the fruit is not really attractive or showy in any way. But in plants that are dispersed by animals, they're competing with other plants to make the most attractive fruits and to attract the animals that will disperse it. Let me share a screen, and we're going to see in this first class. Uh, here we go. The dry fruits. Fruits can be fleshy, as you know, or dry. Let me give you some examples. For example, uh, an apple, a pear, a mango, or a peach are all fleshy fruits. What we eat is the flesh. The flesh is sweet, it smells very nice, it's attractive for animal dispersers, and the plant is actually offering us the fruit to get, as a counterpart, the service of seed dispersal for us to take the embryo somewhere. So basically, the plant is telling animals, you can eat this as long as you take the embryo somewhere and move it away from me. Why? Because the plant doesn't, quote unquote, want. It's evolutionarily disadvantageous for a plant to have the seed germinate immediately under the plant, because it will compete with a mother plant, and probably the shade of a mother plant will kill eventually the offspring. So there is a lot of natural selection or selective pressure for animals to disperse the fruit as far away as possible from the plant. Now, dry fruits, on the other hand, do not have in themselves any type of attachment that makes the fruit attractive to dispersers. And dry fruits, like for example, peanuts. Peanuts are a dry fruit. So what is it that makes dry fruits be dispersed? Well, many dry fruits have attachments on the seed that make them fly very easily with the air. They have little wings. They have little structures that allow them to fly, and they can be dispersed by wind or water. Many fruits are also dispersed by water. The typical example is the coconut that can float in the ocean for a long time, for many, many months, and be dispersed by the currents from one continent to another. It's one of the most amazing stories of successful plant dispersal. Other fruits are dispersed by wind. So let me show you some of dry fruits. Dry fruits have basically, in the categorization that botanists make, have 5 different categories. Have 2 main categories, which is dehiscent, if the dry fruit opens to release a seed, and indehiscent if it doesn't open. A dehiscent fruit opens along one or more sutures. And within dehiscent fruits, there are 5 categories. The most common type of dehiscent fruits are the capsules. Capsules are formed, for example, in plants in the lily family. Capsules are formed by 3 carpels. Remember that the carpels in the lily family are in multiples of 3. And the 3 carpels are fused. The seeds are inside. The placentation is very often parietal. And the fruit can stay in the plant dry, and eventually will start dehiscing. It will start opening and releasing the seed gradually into the environment. Because the seed is inside and the fruit opens gradually, it doesn't release them all in one go, first. And secondly, it will normally release the seed when the fruit is shaken, and that normally happens when there is some wind. Another case of an interesting capsule is in the poppy family. Poppies have capsules. This is an illustration of a capsule of opium poppy, and they have little pores, little holes upside the fruit, and every time wind shakes the capsule, some seed will fall off or fly away some distance. So capsules are one way of retaining seed and shedding it when the capsule is shaken by wind or by some animal. In legumes, remember, is a family of beans. Uh, the fruit is formed by only one carpel that will open along the suture line that is here and also along the midrib vein on the other side. So legumes will open on both sides and gradually release the seed. For example, beans will gradually release the seed into the environment. In many plants, the fruit is a follicle. A follicle is also formed by only one carpel. There are one carpel fruits, one pistil, one carpel, and they have seeds inside. Plants with follicles, like for example the milkweeds, their seeds have very long silky hairs that allow them to float in the air and be dispersed at great distances. And then there are two fruits that are common in the the typical, the distinctive fruit of the cabbage family, the Brassicaceae. One, the most common fruit is known as the silique. Externally, it looks very much like a legume. It looks very much like a bean pod, but it's formed by two carpels, and the two carpels open sidewise, both, and leave a seed inside attached to the suture lines where there is a vein of both carpels, and from there they will start releasing gradually. The mustard seeds, for example, occur in this type of fruit that is known as a silique. And then in other plants, like in Capsella, also in the family, the silique is very shortened and very often heart-shaped, and it is known as a silicle. The other type of, okay, here we have some illustrations of fruits. Here you have a capsule with the carpels that are known as the valves once the fruit opens, the pedicel of the fruit. Here you have a follicle in a milkweed plant. It's very interesting how milkweeds, for example, the fruits themselves become dry and are not fleshy or edible at all, but the seeds have these silky attachments that allow them to flow in the air. So the fruit will eventually open and start releasing the seed in the air or into the air. The legumes, like green peas or like edamame pods, for example, are normally green, but if they stay on the plant, they become dry, and eventually they will open. Most legumes will open and release the seed into the environment. And then finally, you have the siliques in the Brassicaceae, in the cabbage family, in which it's a long pod with two carpels that eventually the carpels open and they leave the central wall known as the septum and the two juncture venations between the carpels to stay behind, and from there the seed is released. Okay, and now we go to indehiscent fruits, fruits that do not open. The whole fruit is the dispersal unit. And indehiscent fruits have four basic type of fruits. As a general word, all indehiscent fruits in some way or other are nuts. But we reserve the word nuts to one in particular, and the others have more specialized names. So to one type of fruit. A nut is basically a large indehiscent fruit. That's all the definition. It can be walnuts, it can be pecan nuts, it can be acorns. Acorns are forms of nuts. They never open. The whole dispersal unit is the nut itself. It's very interesting to spend some time analyzing or discussing the nut as a dispersal mechanism. You might wonder, well, if they do not open and they don't have any flesh, what is the reward to seed dispersers? Are there any organism that disperses them? And what is the reward? Well, the reward for seed dispersers in nuts is basically the nut itself. There are a number of little animals in particular squirrels, ground squirrels, kangaroo rats, um, um, country mice, etc., that will collect nuts and take them to their cave or to their refuge and store them. Very often, they store them in holes in the ground. They bury little holes in the ground and store the nuts. They will eat many of them, but if they are stored in a hole in the ground, or sometimes they store them in trees, but some of them fall off the tree and roll in the ground, and they eventually can become established. If it rains, those nuts that are being moved around by rodents can become established. So basically, it's very interesting here, the question. The plant pays for the service of dispersal of nuts with nuts. Basically, the plant has a quote unquote calculated risk in which for every 100 nuts that it produces, a large number of them, in some plants even 80%, will be eventually eaten by nut gatherers, by squirrels or mice or kangaroo rats, but a few will survive and give rise to new offspring. So basically, Dan Jansen, a great biologist who worked most of his life in Costa Rican tropical ecology, he said there are plants that pay for babies with babies. So basically, the plant is sacrificing some of its embryos in order to get dispersal for the few that don't get eaten. The plant is paying for the service of dispersal by willingly losing some of its offspring, some of its descendants, as long as a few of them are able to be dispersed successfully. The achene is basically a small nut, normally most achenes are less than 5 millimeters or something like that. They're common, especially in two families that we're going to see. One is in the Asteraceae, in the sunflower family. This illustration, by the way, is the seed of the achene, or the seed of the sunflower, the achene. And basically achenes, and also in the Polygonaceae, and the buckwheat family, the fruit is an achene. The achene is like a nut. It has an external cover of the fruit, which is the pericarp of the fruit. The remaining part of the ovary, that is the pericarp. The pericarp is the remaining part of the ovary. They're one-seeded, like nuts are, only one seed inside, and this is the embryo and the endosperm itself. So basically, achenes, a very easy way to remember, are small nuts. And the reason why botanists separate them is because functionally they can be quite different. Achenes are not that often dispersed by the same type of squirrels that are the nut dispersers, and achenes can be dispersed by birds like quail, for example, or smaller organisms, including seed-eating ants. And then there's one fruit that is pretty much like an achene, but the pericarp cannot be separated from the seed itself. The external cover is so attached that it cannot be separated without killing the embryo and the seed. And this is the fruit of grasses, in particular cereals, and we call them caryopsis. Caryopsis are corn kernel, for example, is a caryopsis. A wheat berry is a caryopsis. Oat grain is a caryopsis. The difference between caryopsis and achenes is that caryopsis, as I was telling you, you cannot dehull them like you dehull achenes, or even you can dehull pistachios or peanuts, for example. You cannot dehull caryopsis. The external part of the fruit is perfectly attached to the internal seed. And finally, one particular type of indehiscent fruit that is very common in many plants from different families, it's a case of convergent evolution, are those that have only one seed, and the seed has a long wing, an elongation of the pericarp that is normally feathery or papery, I would say more than feathery, and that allows the seed to turn around like a helicopter and be transported by wind as it falls from trees. And that fruit is known as a samara. Samaras are always dispersed by winds and always occur on trees. So basically, this covers what I wanted to cover today, dry fruits. And next Wednesday, we are going to start seeing fleshy fruits, which are fairly more complex than dry fruits in all their variations and their modes. So thank you very much. Next class will be Wednesday the 15th. Thank you.